Hola amigos, my name is David El Profe, and today I'm going to talk to you about why I teach the way that I teach, starting with the very first lesson from my conversational Spanish program, Let's Start Talking Spanish Foundations 1. So teachers often ask me, why are you teaching that, or why are you doing it that way? And the simple answer is that I have been teaching English since 2001 and Spanish since 2005. And I've basically created the program that I wish had existed for me when I was learning how to speak Spanish, because learning how to speak Spanish was by far the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I've actually come to understand that most teachers out there think that it should be hard. The term productive struggle is a very common term that I come across in this industry, and I couldn't disagree with that anymore. I think, or I should say, I fully believe that learning how to speak a new language like English or Spanish should be a fun and enjoyable experience, and that my job as a teacher is to guide my students down the easiest path possible to help them build up their confidence and enjoy using the new language from the very first day. So yes, students still have to work for it, and the hardest part for my adult learners especially is that they have to find the time to put into it. But by making it fun and entertaining, it has this snowball effect to it. They get super motivated. They feel like they're able to start using it right away, and that just accelerates the learning process. So let's take a look together at the very first lesson that I have here for you. This is Spanish Foundations 1, Lección 1. So I start off by teaching my students how to introduce themselves. And when I'm doing these very first introductory slides, I'm doing this 100% in Spanish, and I coach them through it if they need help. But because of the visual images that are up here on the slides, they don't need a whole lot of help. They typically get it right off the bat. So I'm basically thinking of kind of the most common introductory questions that you might get, right? Like, what's your name? Where are you from? Why are you learning Spanish? It's probably because you might want to travel or you've been to some other countries. I talk about what I do for work, and then I take them through a whole bunch of slides telling them what I like to do for fun, because everybody likes talking about what they like to do for fun, and this is what's going to come up more than anything when people are making friends with Spanish speakers and introducing themselves. So once we get through these introductory slides, keep in mind this is the very first 5 to 10 minutes of class. It's all being done 100% in Spanish, and it's pretty intuitive for my students to pick up. After that, I'll kind of switch back to English. I explain to them kind of the goals that we're establishing for the course, what they can expect to learn at the end of the course. But I'm really trying to take advantage of those first few minutes to actually get them speaking the language, and that builds up their excitement, right? From there, I'll go over, like I said, introducing the course, telling them what we're going to learn in class, and then I'm really big on telling them that these are conversation classes, so they have to talk, they have to ask me questions, and then we go from there. Now, after that, we're going to come back to those greetings and those introductions. This really helps with the repetition. It really helps the new language sink in. They've just done it. They haven't been given really any explanations of what they were saying or why they were saying it. So when I come back and I do it the second time around with them, I give them a little bit more detail. We focus a little bit more on the specific vocabulary and the words that they're using, or the phrases that they're exchanging. And I make it a little bit more about the words as opposed to the visual images like I had in the very first slides. From there, I'm a big believer in nonverbal communication. When I was learning how to speak Spanish, I had my Spanish classes that were teaching me really, very academic Spanish. It was very much based on grammar. The first 10 minutes of my Spanish classes were focused on the verb to be. It was very confusing and very overwhelming. And then there was almost no mention anywhere of nonverbal communication. And I learned that separately in some anthropology classes that I was taking for my international business and intercultural communication classes. And I always wondered, why don't language teachers incorporate culture and nonverbal communication more into their classes? So since the topic of the very first lesson is how to introduce yourself in Spanish, I try to teach my students what that would look like non-verbally as well. And I explain to them that in many Spanish-speaking countries, you do it with a little besito on the cheek. And I explain how that might change from one country to another. So this is nonverbal communication. The academic term for this is called haptics, where you're communicating through touch. And this is different from most English-speaking countries where people will hug their friends and family members. So it's a fun little thing. Students tend to like that a lot. Next, we go into teaching the basic Spanish pronunciation around the 5 vowel sounds. I use a lot of visual images here, as you can see. So I'm not having to spend time teaching them what these new vocabulary words mean. They see it, they repeat after me, they get it, and it's really much more about those vowel sounds as it is to anything else. These visual images, especially like this one you see here, most people have seen Ace Ventura. They kind of think about that movie, and they think about when he's pretending to be the crazy guy in the mental institution for the day. So this always gets a good laugh. That's kind of back to my philosophy that, learning a new language should be fun and entertaining. And when you use images like this, it creates a very good rapport in the classroom, and students really enjoy it a lot. So after we get through the pronunciation, then we'll go back to those introductions again. I teach the most common questions that tend to come up when people are meeting each other. And then you'll notice I'm right back to asking what students like. ¿Te gusta la comida cubana? Si me gusta or no me gusta. Everybody likes talking about what they like. Everybody likes eating food. You can really see the looks on students' faces when these slides are coming up for them. On the food images, their mouths start watering. You get to the slides, especially this one, they can picture themselves sitting on a beach in the Caribbean somewhere, having a nice mojito. We talk about sports. All this is just basically geared towards teaching students what they're probably going to be talking about right off the bat. And psychologically, it's everybody likes talking about what they like. So it's just a really fun section of the class. From there, we're going to go into some useful questions for the students. So just some kind of classroom Spanish, teaching students how to ask, if they can ask a question in the polite way, and then 2 basic questions for navigating meaning. How do you say, how do you say student? ¿Cómo se dice student? Then I run them through an activity where I make them say this over and over and over again. By the way, these are vocabulary words that I'm going to teach again at the end of the class. So each section of this presentation is kind of geared towards leading into another part of this presentation. So they kind of play off of each other, and it creates that repetitiveness, again, that students need in order to really learn how these new vocabulary words and learn how to start speaking the language with confidence. And now we do the flip side of that, where I'm teaching qué significa. So como se dice is like when they want to learn how to say an English word in Spanish. Qué significa is when they want to learn what a Spanish word means in English. And again, it's the same vocabulary again. So it's repetition, repetition, repetition. I see so many programs out there that are so dedicated towards teaching new language skills that they forget to go back and repeat things. But the only way to really develop any type of conversational capacity in a new language is to say things over and over and over again until you no longer have to think about them. So this is all new vocabulary word, but we're going to hit it at least 3 times throughout this presentation. Then we go back in. I just put these questions back up and ask the students if they know what they mean, so I'm checking for that comprehension there. Next, I go into a segment where I'm teaching students about cognates, and I like to share the story of the first bank in the world, which was in Italy. I talk a little bit about how these words can change from one language to another, but essentially the idea here is I'm trying to get students comfortable with the idea that they can try to guess their way through a lot of the language, because on paper, Spanish and English share about 30% of the words. The pronunciation might change a little bit. The spelling of the words might change a little bit. But essentially, students that speak English are not starting from zero with the Spanish language. The idea with this is to really just boost their confidence from the very first class. Let them know that learning how to speak a new language, especially like Spanish, isn't as hard as what they might be thinking. And then we tie it back in to kind of the reason behind this is you want to be able to start guessing through some of these situations. If you think you're hearing something, or if you think you're reading something that looks familiar, chances are that's exactly what you're reading. Okay, let's see here. Next, I just do the numbers up to 10, and I want to share with you a little bit of my thinking behind this. In my Spanish classes, I think on our first day of class, we went all the way up to 100 with our numbers, and it's just overwhelming. It's too much. It is way too hard to learn 100 new numbers in one day, right? But when you just start with the first 10 numbers, there's some really cool activities that then we can do to follow up on this to practice conversation, right? So I'll ask students to tell me whose number this is, and I'll read them off one of these numbers, right? Like I'll just say, ¿de quién es el número 911? Right? And they'll say, oh, that's the emergency number. Or ¿de quién es el número 303-218-6242? And they look at the logo, they're like, oh, that's Walmart. So it's just 10 numbers that we're learning, but we can do a lot of this. This ultimately leads into being able to exchange contact information with somebody, which, if you're following along with me, this lesson's all about introducing yourself to a native Spanish speaker, so you have somebody to practice with, and you're going to have to, at some point, exchange contact information so that you can schedule times to meet. So this is, again, all back to that very first goal with this lesson, which is to get people comfortable with introducing themselves to new people in Spanish so they have people to practice with. We can do another follow-up activity here, talking about how much things cost. And if you'll notice here, I'm talking about paper, markers, pencils. Guess what? That's that same vocabulary that we used in the Como se dice activity. It's the same vocab we used in the que significa activity. And by the way, it's the same vocabulary that we're now going to use in the final activity of this lesson, which is what I call teaching Spanish for both school and work, para matar dos pájaros de un tiro. So thinking about killing a bird, 2 birds with 1 stone here. Most of these words here are highly relevant vocabulary words for new Spanish students, because it's all vocabulary that we have right here in the Spanish classroom with us. And it's also stuff that most people have at their workspace, which is where they spend most of their time, right? So all this stuff, it ties into each other, and it's just a combination of teaching highly relevant vocabulary that people need to learn right away so they can start using it right away. After this, I go back and I lead a little activity here with flashcards. So there's a student workbook that accompanies these PowerPoint presentations that your students should be using. And one of my favorite things about this is that I actually created flashcards that are at the end of each lesson that students can just simply cut out and start studying right away. And we do this together in class. I run them through this activity because I think it's really important that they know what they should be doing between classes. And building up vocabulary, studying vocabulary through flashcards is a very powerful activity to accelerate that learning process. I created thousands of flashcards as a Spanish student. Back in college, I had to do it all by hand. I remember days where my hands were cramping up and it would really hurt. And so I just wanted to, again, make that easy for my students so that they can just focus their time, their very important time as adults, on studying and practicing. So this is very beneficial. Now, I know a lot of teachers out there don't like flashcards, and for the life of me, I do not understand how flashcards have come to be known as a bad word in this industry. When I was coming up through school and getting ready for college, in our college prep classes, they taught us how to use flashcards to study. When I was studying for my exams in college, I used flashcards. I think flashcards are a brilliant way to study and to practice. I have yet to meet somebody that is very fluent in another language that did not use flashcards. So I really don't get it. I was giving a presentation at a conference a couple of years ago, and somebody asked me, well, how do you teach vocabulary? And I said, simple, flashcards. And it just created this rift in the audience. A couple of people actually got up and left. I turned it back on my audience and I asked them, well, can anybody here teach me a better way than flashcards? If you don't like flashcards, that's fine, but somebody teach me a better way. So the best thing that people could come up with is CI, comprehensible input. And I want to say I 100% agree that giving your students reading activities, have them listen to conversations where they're practicing new vocabulary words is incredibly important. It's incredibly powerful. But this is the very first lesson, and students are starting with zero Spanish. So for comprehensible input to work, remember, comprehensible input is where students are exposed to the language that's at their current level +1. So if they're starting from zero, it's just zero. They have no Spanish. So we have to do something to create that first foundation of basic Spanish vocabulary. In future lessons, when you get to higher beginner levels, intermediate, advanced, we don't need flashcards anymore. But this is really geared towards some of these new theories that are coming out about students needing to develop about 1,000 vocabulary words to start understanding the new language in most of their day-to-day interactions with people and to be able to speak it. So thinking about that number, 1,000 high frequency vocabulary words in combination with highly relevant vocabulary words is what students need to get to in order for comprehensible input to be able to work. So I'm all ears. If anybody has a better way to do this, let me know. You've seen I am walking students through visual slides where I'm teaching the vocabulary. So we don't necessarily, so I'm not necessarily using those English words to teach it when I'm doing that. However, when it comes to practice time and maximizing efficiency, I've yet to come across anything more effective than flashcards for developing that initial set of 1,000 vocabulary words. I'm all ears. Please let me know if you have a better way to do it. Love to hear your thoughts about that. Okay, so from there, we've taught our students how to introduce themselves. I have brought up cultural topics. We've done conversational activities. Now I'm showing them actually how to study and how to practice Spanish between classes with these flashcards. This is where I bring up the book again, and I tell them between now and the next lesson to do lesson number 1 in their books. Before we finish up here, we go back to that introduction. This time I'm just putting the vocabulary words and everything that they need to go through this introduction. and students are able to have this conversation with each other with essentially no help from me. Every now and then I might have to remind them what one of these things means, but for the most part, students look around the room, they have this conversation with each other, and then they have this look of awe, like, wow, I'm speaking Spanish, right? So it's an activity, just again, that goes back to repeat what we've been learning in this lesson, and then it's a confidence booster. It makes them feel like they can actually do this. They've actually learned a real skill, how to introduce themselves in Spanish, which they can go out and start having right away, right after class. So it's pretty powerful stuff. It's really amazing to see it. From there, we're not done with class yet. I teach them some new ways to say goodbye. And then I go into this book I wrote, which is called 5 Easy Steps to Speak Spanish with Confidence. This is a book that goes hand in hand with the student workbook. However, this book is really much more geared towards teaching students how to study and practice as opposed to the language itself. And it's got a lot of activities throughout that when students follow these steps, they're amazed at how fast they're able to learn the language. And most students are actually able to become conversational in about 3 months when they actually follow these steps. So the very first step is geared towards helping students understand why they are learning how to speak Spanish. For most people, it's fairly obvious, but you can't really assume that people know why they're doing it. And this activity is just all geared towards motivating my students and inspiring them. I share with them some pretty obvious reasons why learning Spanish is a good idea, with some statistics, some demographic information here. And then I lead them through this little writing activity where they're going to write out on paper exactly why they're studying Spanish and what they're planning on doing with it. Because when they have a deep understanding of why they're doing it, then they're highly motivated, and it creates that snowball effect where they are able to concentrate on it, they're motivated, and they just get it done. I also think it's very important to share my story with learning how to speak my second language, to let them know that I'm human. I'm not just this expert Spanish professor living in the academic ivory towers. I'm a real person. I went through these real struggles that I'm sure they're going to go through as well. So I tell them a little bit about my experience studying Spanish in high school. I didn't really get a whole lot out of it because I didn't know why I was needed to learn Spanish. I had nobody to speak with. I didn't live in a Spanish-speaking community. I had no desires of, using it at work or anything like that. And then I got out into the real world and I started working a construction job and living in an apartment building where all my neighbors spoke Spanish. And all of a sudden I was surrounded by Spanish, both at home and at work. And then I got on a plane and did a full immersion trip in Spain. So when I share these experiences with them, they can relate to it. I talked to them about this one particular day where I was super frustrated. I was in these Spanish immersion classes in Barcelona, 4 hours a day of my Spanish teacher, who didn't speak a word of English, by the way, just speaking to me, blah, 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 entiendes, blah, 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 blah. And for 4 hours a day, I would respond, no entiendo. I had no idea what she was saying. And it was super frustrating. I was ready to give up, and I almost did. However, I did this activity that night before I went to bed where I actually sat down, got my pen and paper out, and I wrote down all the reasons why I was learning how to speak Spanish. And then when I saw those reasons on paper, I decided to keep going, right? And then that was kind of the basis for this entire program that got started back then. So I like to share that story. If you're using this program, if you're planning on using this program to teach your students, obviously you want to personalize some of these slides. Feel free to tell the story about me, but I think it's much more powerful if you actually tell them your story of how you became a teacher and why you're doing it, right? The net result of this activity is once I realized what my real reasons for learning the language were, I motivated myself to keep going. I remember I was about to give up, but I decided to keep going. And then I decided to kind of take a different perspective on it. And I started creating my own little vocabulary lists based off of kind of my daily interactions with people. And then I later used this as kind of a segue into a future activity with them designed at helping them create their own dialogues and building their own vocabulary lists. Again, with that idea in mind that when it's highly relevant in its words and vocabulary, phrases and expressions they can start using right away, they will start using it right away, and it accelerates this whole process. So I can firmly say that I have had students learn how to start speaking Spanish in about 3 months. So it's really powerful. Have your students do this activity, and I really hope that this has been an informative session for you. I'm on social media. This is my direct cell phone number, my email address. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments that you have. I am here for your success. I created this program, like I said at the beginning, because it's something that I wish had existed for me 20, 30 years ago when I first started my language acquisition process for my second language, which is Spanish. And now I've helped thousands of students learn how to speak a new language. I've had dozens of other teachers from around the country and even around the world start using this program with great success. And I'm a firm believer that this is the conversational program that accelerates that path to fluency, that makes learning a language really fun and entertaining. And I'm really excited about the possibility of other teachers using this as well. Suerte!